Me and my friends, we would have these things called ciphers where we would freestyle and we would rap. But most of the people who came into the cipher had written raps. At that point, the work was trying to get into a label office. We had a real big following on MySpace, and so when he would tell people about our music, that kind of cemented their perception of our reputation.
So, whenever we have a special guest in, it's always kind of nice to start, I think, especially for college students, to kind of hear how things got started, how your career got started. So, how did you get your start as a musician?
Wow. So it's the funny thing with that question is I don't think I considered myself a musician until probably getting to college. Whereas when I was in high school, or before high school, 7th grade, a group of friends that I kind of rolled with, they all were into hip hop. Like they were like diehards. We used to call them backpackers. You know what I'm saying? We were into graph writing, DJing, breakdancing, all of that stuff. And I was more introverted. I was more into like spoken word at that time. And so I kept a lot of that stuff to myself. And so I think if you ask me, if anything, I thought I was a writer. And so I was always a writer. But it wasn't until maybe 16 years old, 17 years old. We used to have this thing. I went to De La Salle High School, De La Salle Institute actually, which is in the Bronzeville area, 35th and Wabash here in Chicago. And we used to have this thing called intramurals. And during that time, if you weren't like playing a sport or doing something, you kind of just sat in the bleachers and you goofed around. And so me and my friends, we would have these things called ciphers where we would freestyle and we would rap. But most of the people who came into the cipher had written raps, particularly those who like thought they were really good at it, right? So one day I kind of kicked what was essentially a spoken word poem kind of situation into the cipher, so it was over a beat. And everybody was like, we didn't even know you could write like that. You know what I mean? Everybody was kind of surprised and like amazed at what I was able to do. And I like that feeling, that rush that came from like people kind of adoring my work. I was like, whoa, like the stuff that I've been sitting and writing kind of in private, people enjoy it. So I started from that point kind of like sharing my gift for writing, or what I perceived to be a gift for writing, in more public venues. Here there was a place in Chicago on Tuesday nights. It was a place called Subterranean, where there was kind of this like, I don't know, I don't want to give it, I don't want to say it was world famous, but it definitely was nationally recognized as like an open mic that you would go to if you wanted to kind of check the barometer of where your skills were. And I mean, like, I saw people get booed off stage that had record deals there. I saw people battle there. It was kind of the pulse of, like, I guess what would be considered, more underground hip hop at the time in Chicago. There were other scenes and, things change and progress over time. But when I was in high school, that was the place to be on Tuesday night. And if you had flow, if you had skill, you would go up there and showcase your talent. And so I would go there weekly. There were other parties. There was a crew called Humble Quest. There was a crew called Ill Nature. During this time, I met people from Chicago. I went to high school with Hebrew Brantley, who's like a super famous artist at this point. Artist as in a visual artist, not a musical artist. And I met a ton of producers during that period. My cousin kind of introduced me to that scene. I skipped over that part. I looked up to my cousin. His name was Corey, but he went by Memo, and he was a part of this crew called the Mole Men. And his best friend was a rapper by the name of Rhyme Fest. And so I used to just really follow my cousin around, and that's kind of where I kind of was like, okay, I'm a writer, I'm an MC. But then it was when I got to college, kind of similar to kind of a similar position to kind of where you are right now. I went to the University of Pennsylvania, and I was in Philly, and everybody there was like, I'm a musician, I'm a musician, I'm a musician. And these were MCs, and so I was like, oh, okay, maybe I'm a musician. And so that's kind of where I realized that, what I was doing was more musical than it was, you know, owning that title of being a musician and kind of delving into the sonic part of it and the studio aspect of it. That didn't happen until I went to college. Um, it, it was largely performative before that point.
Were there particular artists or records that were an inspiration in kind of making that transition?
Oh, for sure. I was like really caught up into the raucous spit kicker era, and so it was kind of ironic that our first record deal was with Raucous because I listened to Black Star, that and really Mos Def's first album, Black on Both Sides, that was an inspiration to me. Common's like Water for Chocolate was like it was life changing for me. That Jay Dilla sound and Common's lyrics with that record kind of, it wasn't the first Common album I bought or anything like that, but it was the first Common album that like inspired me to want to rap. Because Resurrection, I think most people would consider Resurrection and One Day It All Makes Sense. Those are classics as well. And those who are younger would probably consider B, which is the first record he did with Kanye, as being like classic or whatever. But for me, like Water for Chocolate was like, it felt more like the hip hop that I was wanting to make at the time. Slum Village had put out Fantastic Volume 2. That was like influential. Tribe Called Quest, what they were doing, Things Fall Apart by The Roots. These were all albums that kind of shaped me as an MC. I listened to everything. I was an omnivore music, period. But like the stuff that like made me want to rap was more lyrical. It kind of had that Dilla sound. That Dilla sound kind of changed the way I looked at hip hop and the things you could do sonically. Also, No ID, the stuff he was doing, DJ Premier, Gangstar. I could go on, but yeah, those were the records that really like influenced me.
What about, so could you talk a little bit more about your first record deal? So when you first started kind of working with the industry as an artist, how did that come about? How did you get signed and what was that like?
So unlike now where I think things occur bottom up, everything was top down. And so, at the time, what you would have to do is create a demo, a 4-song demo, meaning you would go into the studio and try to create your 4 best tracks. And at that point, the work was trying to get into a label office and kind of get that demo to somebody important, get them to listen. Really, that meant like hobnobbing with interns. You guys are at Northwestern. Most of the people I knew who were like working at labels were low on the totem pole, but everybody kind of scoured. And this was like, when I was in college, like that was part of when Kids in the Hall formed. That was part of like our way of getting our music to audiences. So we were starting to use Facebook to talk to our friends at other colleges, telling them to book us at their schools. Particularly on the East Coast and in that area, like if you were in the tri-state area, we were trying to like get our music out that way. But during that period of time, we were creating a demo. And my partner Double O, we created a demo tape in his off-campus apartment. And so we just kept working on that demo. And then during the summers when school wasn't in, we would go to New York and we would go to Atlanta and we would fly to LA, and we would try to figure out ways to crack the code. And just anybody and everybody that could give us a link to somebody in the music industry, we would have to physically try to go find them. So that meant like if they were at a party, we would physically hand them the demo tape. I would rap in front of people, like we would run up on people and it would just be like, you got 10 seconds to tell me what you need to tell me. Whereas, today, now, you're finding things on the internet and through YouTube, and you can kind of tell people to check things out in other ways. You can email people, you can DM people. Being relentless at that time meant like flying somewhere, taking an Amtrak train somewhere, sleeping on a friend's couch. It meant like you had to physically go. You had to beg your parents for money. You had to steal money. You had to figure things out, work a work-study job and not spend it on what you were supposed to be spending it on. I worked internships and like stole mailing lists of important people for my own purposes. I got myself into spaces with a mission, and so everything about the mission was how do we get our music in front of these important people? Because if we do and they listen to it, because that's the thing, you meet people, they tell you they're going to listen to it, they don't. And but we were like, if somebody actually pays attention to what we give them and we make that first impression and the packaging is right and the music is right, then they'll bite on it. And that's kind of what happened. We had a couple of people who bit, so to speak. Just Blaze, who's a producer, most people know him from producing for Jay-Z. He had met my partner Double O at Sony Studios because Double O was interning at Sony at the time. He passed him our demo. He said it was dope, and that was like a big deal. It wasn't a record deal, but it was like somebody who's really in the industry says what we're doing is dope. And so he started playing the music for people that he knew, and that turned into something, right? And so then we generated a certain amount of buzz on MySpace. That was a way for people to kind of check your reputation at the time. So it's like you would tell somebody about an artist, but it's kind of what you probably do now with YouTube or Instagram or Twitter. You're like, okay, somebody told me this person is really good, but why don't they have a following? Whereas we had a real big following on MySpace. And so when he would tell people about our music, that kind of cemented their perception of our reputation. Like, oh, they're doing these college shows. They're doing pretty well for themselves in their space. And so from there, a talent scout by the name of John Monopoly, who's from Chicago, contacted my manager, who essentially was not really a manager, just a friend of mine who I went to college with. We didn't know what we were doing. And he contacted him, and then we set up a meeting, and it kind of just steamrolled from there. They flew us to New York, and then they put us in this super fancy hotel, and they kind of recruited us and told us they were going to give us the world, and they didn't. But, at the same time, it felt like they were. And, that was the point that it was real to my parents, because they were like, okay, is there some money involved in this thing? You're spend everything you've been doing thus far. It's cool, but you're putting out. Nobody's spending on you. And so that was the moment where it kind of became real to her. And then I think we kind of had a bidding war after that. Like 2 or 3 other labels were trying to get us, and then like maybe 10 days later we signed our record deal, and that was like real simple. It was like when they want you, and they go to the lengths that it takes to kind of secure the artist. But John Monopoly is actually somebody who, if you haven't heard of, you should, look up. He's a very influential tastemaker in the Chicago hip-hop scene. He's somebody who now is probably most well known for managing Kanye West, but he was a party promoter, and he went from kind of being a party promoter to managing producers, and he's managed other artists. He's managed Carl Thomas, he managed Shauna, he managed King Louie, he's managed a lot of people who've come from the Chicago scene. He had a hand in starting G Herbo's career. He's had a hand in kind of everybody who's been involved with Kanye, kind of helping them along in their career. And so like his space has been like cemented as like he was kind of like a mini mogul in the Chicago scene. And so for him to kind of contact me, he was like, yo, we're gonna get you a deal. It's just kind of where and who. So once I got connected to him and we did a production deal with him, that was kind of a big deal. But yeah, like, I kind of knew once he got in contact with us that it was gonna happen, because he had Kanye at the time. He had No ID at the time. He was working at Violator, helping Missy with her projects. He was doing a lot of things where I was like, okay, it's gonna happen at any moment. But it was those 4 songs that we created in the dorm room that ended up being like the thing,
And when you say a demo tape, was it a CD that you were?
At the time, yeah, it was a CD. It was definitely a CD. We had our demo on our MySpace as well. So when you would go to our MySpace, there was 4 songs, the 4-song playlist. And, if we made a song that we thought was better than one of the 4 songs, we would replace it. I think that's one of the things that MySpace allowed at that time was, as your sound evolves, as you get better, you could kind of change what you felt you wanted to present to the world in that way. Um, yeah, we got a little bit more sophisticated at a certain point. We started buying iTunes cards and giving them to people, and because we felt like people, basically giving people free music, but then our music would be preloaded onto those iTunes cards. Sometimes when we met DJs, we would just hand them memory sticks, which at that time were a little more cumbersome than they are now. But even still, DJs were more technological, and so we could just be like, here. Did a lot of mass emailing. My freshman year, we used Napster. We used a few different LimeWire. We would just seed our music in blog sites, message boards. We were our own interns, for lack of better terms. Like, we would spend hours on hours trying to like defeat the internet. That was like, we felt like that was our way in. We felt like the internet was the new street team. We couldn't afford a street team, and we felt like the space in which we were operating on as kind of like early adopters and being on a campus like this that's a little bit more elite and has a ton of resources, we were like, okay, well, we can basically just abuse this college's resources to promote ourselves. That was really how we looked at it at the time. And so any way we could get funding for something, we would use the university in any capacity. If we could borrow video cameras to shoot videos, if we could borrow, studio equipment, that Double O, who my partner and Kids in the Hall, he was an engineer, so he was like very much into the technological aspect of it, and he would rent equipment. And I was like, because he had like a state-of-the-art studio in his apartment building, so we kind of made that ground zero. And we had a bunch of friends. I'm a fraternity guy, so we would promote ourselves incessantly on campus, and that's just kind of how it worked. You know what I mean?
So you mentioned the Chicago scene, and you are, a big part of that scene over the course of some really incredible dramatic changes. Can you just tell us a little bit about kind of what the hip hop scene was like at that time when you were first signing and kind of moving into that kind of level of your career, and kind of maybe how it's changed over time?
So when I come back, like for like maybe my second year of college, I'm full of myself. I'm like, okay, I'm like doing my thing on this campus and in Philly. In Philly, for those who aren't really familiar with the hip hop scene in Philly, Philly has its own scene that's super important at this time. Jill Scott is just coming out. The Roots are like the biggest thing in terms of buzzing in hip hop. There were several other artists like Music Soul Child, Bilal. There's just a lot happening during this period of time, and Philly has a real soulful hip hop scene that's starting to occur. And then on the street side, there's like Beanie Siegel and Freeway, and like this is all happening while I'm in college. And Philly is like its own thing. Allen Iverson is playing for the Sixers. Like, there's a real thing happening in Philly where like there's an identity that Philly is starting to build for itself within the music scene. And so I'm in Philly doing my thing. I'm doing shows. I'm starting to get a name for myself. And so I come home and I think like everybody's going to respect that. And no one, like, that's cool. You went to college. That's what's up. But like, that doesn't mean anything here. And so, when I left, there was the open mic scene. And when I came back, everybody was kind of like in studios. And like, that was kind of the space. It was like, if you were taking it seriously, you were no longer doing open mics. You were no longer like just freestyling. You were trying to make songs. So it went from being about reputation and performance and in battling to being about like, how do we get into the industry? And I think Kanye happens, and then everybody kind of has this thing where like, okay, we can actually do this. It's a real thing. We can professionalize it. There's still no infrastructure. Chicago just has a ton of talent and no kind of talent brokers. There's maybe 2 or 3 real important talent brokers, John Monopoly being one of those, right? And so, at the time, for me, it was just like, I was like, okay, well, how do I insert myself into that scene? And so really, again, reconnecting with my cousin, at that point, Rhymefest is starting to take off. So I start hanging out with my cousin again, and now we're like in the studio. It went from being like outside every night to like being in the studio. and trying to make songs that were going to be appealing to labels. And so it starts happening, Kanye gets Rhymefest, his first deal with J Records. After that, Shauna signs with Ludacris. These are people who I was around directly. Twista signs with Rockefeller. That becomes like a big deal. Jay-Z signing an artist from Chicago. Smaller artists like GLC get record deals with Sony. There was like quite a few people that were slowly but surely getting their deals. Carl Thomas signs with Bad Boy. He's an R&B artist, but still it was like a win for the culture. I don't, as much as I don't want to mention him, R. Kelly, he has a space in pop music at this time where, it feels like Chicago has a thing that's starting to occur during that moment. And so for me, I was like more on the underground side. I connected more with like Common, because Common is like doing his thing. And so his connection to kind of the underground hip hop scene spawn like for me like the idea that like I could do it. Him and Kanye kind of doing what they were doing, I think it kind of influenced what most of the people around me were seeing, in terms of like, okay, we can like craft this sound, and the stuff that we've been doing is like worthy now. There's several other artists that I'm forgetting that were doing their thing that influenced me, but those were like the figureheads of the space. And so it went from like, really trying to be in open mics to now let's try to create EPs, let's try to create albums. People were trying to find like independent labels to kind of invest in them. In terms of hip hop, the reality of it is sometimes, you had folks who either connected with folks who like had money already, like trust fund kids, or like people who, had a little bit of disposable income to invest in what you were trying to do, or you went to like the illicit side, the street side. So there would be like, drug dealers who had money to spend and they wanted to invest and kind of diversify their portfolio. And so they would invest in artists, and, you would see that happen where like, you'd be like, where the heck is this person getting all this money from? Like, how are they shooting $50,000 videos? How did all of a sudden do they have chains on? Last week they didn't have anything. How are they recording at CRC downtown? But that was happening at the time. So, I think everybody was just in a mad scramble during that period to try to like do something bigger. But there still wasn't, the internet still wasn't what it was. So there wasn't a way to really broadcast what we were doing in our scene. You still had to hop on a plane and go somewhere else to really like take meetings and do business. And so that was kind of the space of where things were at until maybe like 2006, 7, 8, maybe, where like, okay, now the internet is making it so that our scene can kind of broadcast onto what I would like to call like the digital street. Where like, okay, I can stay exactly where I'm at, but like if it looks like where I'm at, I'm the man, then people will see it. They'll see it on Facebook. They'll see it on Twitter. They'll see it on YouTube. They'll see it. Instagram wasn't really a thing for real until 2010, but like eventually once Instagram happens and all of these avenues that kind of democratize tools, as we say, that made Chicago a thing, because Chicago had a scene and it was it was formidable, but it was operating in the shadows at the time.
Speaking of the digital street,
yeah.
So this week we were talking about kind of the Napster moment and the kind of industry crash. Mm-hmm. How did that factor into your experience or the scene? How did that affect this exciting, expanding scene?
It's interesting because I like to tell people I was probably a part of the crash as much as, anything else. Like, I was a part of a generation who was going to college at the time the Napster becomes big. So I was stealing music. I think there's a statute of limitations. Nobody's coming out. I was stealing so much music. You know what I mean? Like, I was stealing so much music my freshman year of college because that was the first time I had like really high speed internet. And so I was stealing like thousands and thousands of songs at a time. I would, you could just lose yourself in genres. And so for me, it was a gift. And like I said before, we were trying to figure out how to crack the code of like getting our music to a massive amount of people at the same time. And so for us, it was like, okay, every friend that I have in college, I can send my mixtape over this platform. And while there was no real money attached to it at the time, oftentimes we got shows based on like people spreading our music. And so for me, it was like, this is the greatest thing ever. So while, you know, groups like Metallica and Dr. Dre were talking about how the internet is terrible, and how like file sharing is terrible, I think they were just at a period of time where the model hadn't caught up to the technology. And so for me, I think I ushered in our group, I would say, was a part of ushering in kind of using the internet as a tool, because we always wanted to operate DIY and we always kind of operated independently. We always had distribution, but we never considered ourselves major label artists. So we always considered what we were doing to be a guerrilla tactic. You know, we never had the big budgets, so we always had to cut corners. Even after signing our record deal, we always cut corners to try to figure out how to get our music to wider audiences. And so I think for me, it was kind of unfortunate that, you know, we blazed those trails, but like we weren't able to necessarily see the fruits of our labor. But like some of the artists that I ended up mentoring, you know, like Vic Mensa and Chance the Rapper, they reaped the rewards 20 times over. So it's like a gift and a curse, because people will still acknowledge, like, you know, if I see Chance today, he's like, yo, if it wasn't for you, blah, blah, blah. But like when we were talking about doing everything independent, everybody was like, you're crazy, you know, because the model hadn't caught up with the technology yet. And it was ever changing. I think now it's starting to slow down, where the industry again has figured out how to monetize the artists to the extent of that they can do it lawfully, right? And so that's kind of like how I saw Napster. I saw it being like, I was among the wave who was happy about it, and then it kind of got taken away because, you know, as with all technology, you're speaking about the history of music, but like in media in general, when technology comes on the scene, there's panic. It's like, what are we gonna do? They're taking money, they're stealing. Eventually, you can't put a fort up and stop the technology from ever evolving. It's gonna keep evolving because technologists are gonna keep building on it and building on it. It's gonna get more efficient. It's gonna get better. You know, I think now you could probably steal 3 million songs at a time, while I was stealing like 10,000 songs at a time. You know what I mean? So the way to kind of combat that is to figure out how to kind of work with the technologists and the people who control the data. And that's what's happened with streaming, is the industry has bought into that as the new model. And so we were kind of tweeners. We were in the space where that was just starting to happen, and I think we ushered it in. You know, I think blogs were very important. You're going to have Andrew Barber here next week. You know, Andrew Barber was like super important to my career, but I had a one-to-one relationship with him. As much as he was important to my career, I think it worked vice versa, because he was like, okay, well, I need people who I can talk to on a regular basis, and I need to know where I need to be at in order to report on these things. And so he needed access, and so I think the bloggers helped each other. You had sites like Pitchfork who also were helpful in kind of like highlighting artists that didn't have the budgets that major labels were giving out. And so these were happening in Chicago. Pitchfork is a Chicago thing. You know, Fake Sure Drive is a Chicago thing. Another website at the time, rubyhornet.com, is a Chicago thing. And that was like our version of, there were other national blogs happening out of New York, like Nah Right, TwoDopeBoys.com, Hip Hop DX, which was operating out of Los Angeles. There were a couple other blog sites, hiphopgame.com, OK Player, which was operating out of Philadelphia. My first job in Philadelphia was interning for Questlove at OK Player, and I was like my way into the scene. I mean, I remember, like, I begged to be an intern. Basically, all that meant was like sending out Roots merch to fans and things like that. But I knew just doing that, I got free concert tickets. I got to go backstage. I got to be around what I wanted to be around immediately. You know, all of my jobs and internships surrounded like this mission of putting myself around people who were important to the space. And so yeah, like technology is wrapped into all of that. Like I think, that those experiences and being college kids, just to be real, like I was like, okay, there's two ways you could do hip hop. You could either like do it the smart intellectual way, or you could do it the street way. And I was like, this is the way that fits for me. And so I was like, I had some street ties, but I wasn't making street music. So I was like, the best way for me to do it is to utilize my brain and my intellectual ability and my network, which is kind of what you guys can do here as well at Northwestern. Like I was at UPenn, but the same resources exist here at Northwestern. It's just like how you leverage them.
Speaking of networks, you mentioned earlier your manager.
Yeah.
And last week we had somebody here who had a career as an artist lawyer. So I think it's always interesting to hear kind of the team that's around. So you had a manager. Did you have other experiences with lawyers, agents? Who were important in your team as an artist?
So I had two managers. Well, ironically enough, before we became a group, Double O was actually my manager. So like, Double O was the DJ, producer, and the manager. We had like 7 or 8 guys. We had like what amounted to a flop house my last year in college or whatever. No, not my last year, my first year in college. We had like a flop house. And like, there were like 7 or 8 guys who were doing like marketing promotions. We were all like promoting parties on campus and doing that type of stuff. And it kind of dwindled down because people started getting jobs and their parents started being like, yo, you need to focus and get your shit together. And like, it ended up being like 4 of us. One of those people was Dan Salamito. He was on the basketball team. And he also was interning at Elektra Records for Sylvia Rhone, who was a Penn grad, right? And so we didn't know anything about the industry, but we were like, he works for Sylvia Rhone, so that's an important relationship. So he automatically just became our manager. And he was in New York every day. So we were like, okay, he's in New York every day. He can talk about our music when we're not around. My partner Double O was important to the situation because he was an engineer, he was a producer, and he was a DJ, meaning I had like everything in one person. So like I didn't have to go outside of like the container to like outsource anything. So he handled like the sonics of it. All I had to really do was rap and like take on a persona and be confident in myself. And then one of my fraternity brothers who was on the football team, his name was G Martin. He was my other manager, and he was kind of the mouth. He just kind of would run around promoting, and he was from LA, and he had like a whole LA thing. But when he went home, he would talk about the music to people in LA. So we had people in New York, and we had people in LA. I'm from Chicago. It's like when summer happened, we would go home and talk about what we were doing. That was like our form of like social networking, right? And so that was kind of the way it worked. And as soon as I graduated, we all moved to LA and like set up shop in LA. And like we kind of made it our point to kind of work that scene and work it until we couldn't work it anymore. It was great that MySpace was actually headquartered in LA. They put us on the front of MySpace. We had like 1 million plays on one of our songs. And that really kind of started everything. But like, yeah, like that was the importance. But ultimately, like Dan ended up staying my manager the whole time. Still is my manager to this day. We took on another partner, Matt Marcus, who ironically, I interned for him at one point while I was in college. He worked at a more boutique record label in New York City. And so, yeah, I was just hustling. Like, internships were how I found managers, and like classmates were how I found managers. We brought Matt in. Matt had industry connections that were a little bit above Dan's, but they both had the same they both had what we considered like industry ends already. And Matt also had a bit of money from his own. He had a small label that he ran that, he had it more together than most of us. He was older than all of us, so that was a thing too. Dan was my age. Matt was like maybe 8 years older than me, and so he brought kind of a level of expertise that was a little different. And then finally, we brought in someone on the booking side to kind of like really push that, and then also brand partnerships. That was Dan Glogauer. These were all people who went to Penn, though. So that was the interesting thing. Is like even though there were different years and different graduating years, different generations, there were that whole everything came from like the Penn network. Wharton School of Business in particular. So it was like, okay, we knew we were all smart and kind of enterprising, but we didn't really, we had a goal. We didn't know how we were going to reach it, but like, I think your peers are the people you should start businesses with, and not, I think you don't have to necessarily look up. You can just look left or right, and you'll probably find your partners right there with you, and then you guys can grow together, and that's kind of what we did. We looked at our music as like a startup venture. And, so Matt was kind of like our first investor technically. Like, I think, I won't even say I think, that's exactly what happened. Like Matt was able to invest in us at a level that we weren't able to invest in ourselves at the time. And so he kind of became, our senior manager. And then Dan was kind of like our junior manager, so to speak.
It's a great reminder of all the resources you have around you at a place like Northwestern or Penn, people and equipment. It's a great thing. I got a couple more questions, then we'll open it up. So, can you talk about your shift from working in the music industry to going back to school and academia?
Yeah.
How did that happen?
So I'll start it like this, because a lot of times people say like, "Oh, why did you leave the music industry?" For a period. And I say it like this: you don't leave the music industry leaves you. So that's like first and foremost. Like, things can slow down. Like, if you're hot or you're buzzing, you're a buzz artist or whatever, there's a point where you have to go from being on the bill to being a headliner. And like, it just didn't happen for us. Like, we didn't get to the space where, at least that was to my liking, where like I think we could have stayed in the position that we were at, and kind of just plugged along as an indie act, really grinded out on these tours in 18-passenger vans, and like kind of did that thing, 200 dates a year, and just stay with that, and just hope that at some point something pops. But I was impatient, and so I think I was kind of like starting to think about, like, as I'm getting older, I had my son. I'm like, well, what is something that can keep me around the thing that I love, but also give me stability? So I built a studio in Chicago, and I started running a commercial recording studio in Chicago, and that kind of was what I was doing to like pay the bills. In addition to like songwriting, producing, whatever else I was doing musically, and putting out my own mixtapes or whatever. Through that process, I started being asked to mentor youth, to bring youth into the studio. And that went down a long, windy road where, I went from like just mentoring youth from time to time to like starting a full-fledged like program, and then being asked to be a teaching artist, being asked to be like kind of a consultant in nonprofit settings for arts nonprofits, and for groups that were really focused on trying to do hip-hop based education. And then that got to the point where I was like, wow, okay, this can be a thing. So I kind of, the same way I kind of fell into rapping by just voicing my talent in like a high school intramural period, the same thing kind of happened in terms of doing youth work. I started being asked to speak, and I just started saying yes, because I would get asked before that, and I would be like, oh, I'm too busy. And then it just started being fun to me, and that kind of spiraled into me having like questions that could only really be solved by research. And then like I started like doing research and reading other people's research, and then contacting those people and going down this windy road. And eventually people were like, why don't you go back to school? Like, some of the questions you're asking are like very academic, and I was like, you can do that? Like, you can study hip hop, and like I could get a PhD doing that? And they were like, yeah, you can. Like, you just need to know, what program what school and what program will let you kind of ask the questions that you're asking, and you should contact the people that you're reading because people love their ego stroke. I'm realizing that now, particularly in academia. You tell somebody you read their work and you love it, then they'll answer you immediately. And so, I took a lot of people to lunch and met up with people. In some instances, flew to where they were at, and like, yeah, I was convinced then that like academia was something that was for me. It has a lot of parallels with being a musician, and that like it's your work, it's performative. You get to publish something, and you own your ideas, and people kind of take those things in and they consume them. So, and then I think there's some parallels with like how record labels and universities are these overarching institutions that promote your work, but they benefit off of you at the same time. For me, it's an interesting situation because being paid to think is something, and being paid to think and being paid to write were things that were always of interest to me. So when I was very young, I thought I was going to be a sports journalist. Then that kind of shifted into this idea of doing music, and now it's kind of moved into academia. But the thread through all of it has been like writing and publishing, and like that's always been a focus of mine is my ideas and my interpretation of the world being spread to a wider audience in some way, shape, or form. And so I think it goes without saying too. Both of my parents were academics; they're both PhDs. So like, it wasn't like this idea came out of nowhere. It was kind of like, okay, well, before music ever reached a level of being professional for me, I was like, oh, I'll go to grad school. Like that was always a thing. And so for those who really knew me closely, it was like, oh, that made more sense to them than me being a rapper. It's like, oh, you just tied in, what you love with what we thought you were gonna do anyway. So it's been an interesting transition. Although academia has its bumps, is just the same way the music industry does. But I've been blessed enough to be in this situation, to be in the city that I'm from, and still be able to kind of connect with the scene that I come from, and do work and research that surrounds like the spaces I inhabited before. And so that's given me a lot of access in doing research because it's like I have a different level of positionality in the space.
Great. My last question. So, could you just tell us a little bit about your current research?
Okay, so you mentioned a dissertation project, which is hip hop based education, looking at a program called Foundations of Music, and their songwriting and production program placed within middle schools within the Chicago public schools. And so I spent like 4 years doing participant observations, interviews, focus groups, sitting in on classes, a lot of like deep hanging out with some of the participants in this program. And some of the things that I found are that, hip hop, besides giving, a fun lesson to some of these youth, and it can help them to critically engage in academic thinking and develop habits of mind. And also this idea of occupational identity and public voice, which are things that translate well in today's society, just because nowadays with the way social media works, personal branding is more important now than ever. And hip hop is one of those spaces where you get taught very early on how to personally brand yourself. And the whole objective is to innovate and stand out from the crowd. And so if we're teaching young men and women of color to do that at an early age, to me, that's kind of like a way for us to kind of close the gap in some of the disparities that we see in educational outcomes for youth of color. And so, that's kind of the dissertation. But this new project that I've been exploring, that I started last summer, is looking at DIY rappers and the ways in which they use social media. And so I spent a lot of time during this 4-year period kind of interacting with youth who were doing hip hop. They kind of operated in this space of drill music. So for those who are kind of familiar with Chicago's hip hop scene, it's kind of a more gangster leaning type of music that's specifically set on the south side and west sides of Chicago. It kind of talks a lot about street cliques and gang life, and just kind of it's kind of like the everyday life of a teenager in some of these marginalized communities that you see on the news every day. And so I started getting involved in wanting to know more about what their lives were outside of school, and kind of what was influencing the type of music that they were making, and how they were kind of forging creative careers once they left this like middle school existence, and even in some cases left this high school existence. Like, where do you go to if you're not able to do what I did, which is like go to college and then figure out how to get a demo to somebody and whatever else. Like these kids were mastering YouTube, mastering Instagram, mastering Snapchat in ways I don't know how to do. But I was like, how the hell do you have 100,000 followers and you're 15? This makes no sense. You know what I'm saying? But they would show. I was like, show me. Like, what do you do every day? And so that's kind of what that research project is kind of amounting to. And so I have a couple papers that I've already started. And through that project, I got an internship in Microsoft last summer in their social media collective. And so I presented that work to like a bunch of computer scientists and economists and people who probably know nothing about rap music. But it was interesting in being able to kind of talk about how kind of what I was seeing in that space relates to their work. And so, the importance of kind of inadvertent ways in which technology is used can inform a lot of different things. In particular, in thinking about drill music, a lot of times in hip hop, we operate from a space of a have-not and trying to make something out of nothing. And that's what many of the youth that I studied were doing, is they only had a mobile phone. And they didn't have a recording studio, but they had an iPhone, they had iVideo. They were able to, they taught themselves how to make beats on iPads. In many cases, they borrowed equipment, borrowed phones, shared phones. But they found ways to defeat search engine optimization. They found ways to kind of defeat the algorithm and get their music to be in trending topics in their local area. They found ways to make sure that they created terms like drill and Chirac, in which you could put that in the search engine and immediately their videos would pop up. And so that was fascinating to me, because they were on a never-ending like search for clout, and they were kind of winning that. And so that's kind of what I'm kind of looking at within this project, is kind of something that I've termed the clout economy. And it's pretty cool, because it's one of those things where now we see music turning into like a background thing, and like the forefront is like personality and ability to wield influence. And some of these youth that I was around, who were from these super marginalized areas and like places that are considered like the digital divide target, right? It's not that they don't have access to digitalization. Like, they have the access, it's just they participate differently. And so with social networking, they're able to talk to one another. And so in talking to one another, they're generating this level of data that allows artists like Lil Durk and Chief Keef and G Herbo to generate millions of views, and nobody know who they are outside of their neighborhood. And so I think the case studies that I'm seeing within that space are like really fascinating, and thinking about like lean startups and how we can do marketing and promotion on shoestring budgets. And it's interesting because the ways in which they were using the internet in 2009 and 2010, 2011 are just now being adopted by major labels in 2020. So that's the fascinating part to me, is those who were considered erased from the digital landscape were actually innovating. And so that's kind of like the juxt of that project.
Amazing.